like to introduce Cortney Henseler from AOL. So please welcome Cortney. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully it doesn't make that noise again, sorry. Thanks for sticking around before the break. I promise I'll give you some very interesting information, hopefully, and you can ask me questions later. So at AOL, we get a lot of questions from advertisers, who are a lot of our clients, about mobile and tablet and multi-platform usage. And so we do a lot of research to really help understand the consumer in that frame of reference, to give back to our clients and give them some really interesting information. One of the questions we get a lot is, what is the best use of mobile in the mix that I have in my digital marketing? How much should I be spending on mobile? How should I be using mobile? There's actually a lot of industry knowledge out there already that's been written about, a lot that I'm sure a lot of you guys have already read, that kind of talk about what are the best practices supposed to be as it relates to mobile. Talk about geolocation services a lot, mobile couponing, showrooming, geofencing. It's in all of the sort of industry accepted wisdom that these seem to be the ways that marketers should be using mobile devices. There's also a lot of information about how people actually use their mobile devices just from behavioral tracking and passive data that we have and that a lot of syndicated research resources have. So across AOL, we can actually track how consumers are accessing our different platforms. We can tell if they're coming from the desktop, if they're coming from tablet, if they're coming from the mobile web, and the actual size and how much time they're spending across each of those devices over the course of the day. Syndicated data also exists. Comscore has a lot of multi-platform information that can look at tablet versus smartphone versus desktop and how much time is being spent. You can actually look at different categories of content to see how does that differ. So what's actually accessed more across the mobile, be that tablet or smartphone versus the desktop. There's a lot of all of this information out there about what consumers are doing, what they're consuming. There's some industry accepted knowledge and conventional wisdom around what is the best way to use mobile to actually market to consumers. And there's a lot about even how consumers feel about those devices. Yahoo even talked about this morning the love of the device and the love of the smartphone and how consumers use it to multitask and things like that. What we still found, though, was that we really thought that something was still missing within this whole package of how consumers are actually using their mobile devices and how that fits into their daily lives. What was missing was really this human truth. So there's a couple of different research pieces that we did over the course of the last year and a half or so to really try to uncover what that truth really was in terms of why consumers are actually using their smartphones and their tablets in the way that they are and how it's fitting into their daily lives. One of the ways we did that was through our 7 Shades of Mobile research, where we actually looked at the entire smartphone experience. So this is some data just smartphone only. So we didn't want to include tablet in here, because we wanted to look at smartphones specifically in terms of how consumers are using their smartphone to access content. So again, this didn't talk about texting, emailing, any sort of communication, purely content and how they're consuming content on their smartphone. And we did it in 3 different waves of information. So we did qualitative journals and diaries. We also used some Arbitron metered data and tied that into quantitative surveys. So we were getting some behavioral data as well as surveying those same people to understand within each moment when they're actually consuming content on their mobile device, what's going on? What are they doing? How satisfied are they with the content? How do they feel about advertising? Where were they? What was their motivation for actually going to consume that content? And what we came up with was basically a segmentation scheme for the motivation and the ways in which consumers actually consume content on their smartphone. What we found was that mobile's actually often not mobile. So 68% of all minutes in terms of content and consuming content are actually done at home. So this is smartphone. So all of the press and stuff that's out there about geolocation services, geofencing, mobile couponing when they're actually close to your store, that has a purpose, but it's not a huge portion. It doesn't feed into the overall majority amount of time that consumers are actually spending and where they're actually spending that time when they're consuming content on their smartphone. And there are actually 7 distinct motivations when you actually break this down into a traditional, what you would think of as a segmentation scheme and analysis. If you take the motivations for why the consumer was actually going to their smartphone to go get that piece of content or go to Amazon, go to weather.com, why are they going to those places? It can fall into any of these 7 different reasons. Accomplish, which is basically to get something done. Socialize, to communicate with somebody, but again, in the content phrase, not anything that relates to texting or phone or emailing. Prepare, get ready for my day. Me time, which is a very relaxed, lean back, just entertain me mode. Discover, to learn something new. Shopping, which is actual shopping, so making a purchase, or just preparing to shop, like you're getting ready to go out to a store or things like that. And then express, which is sort of the purest form of creativity, self-expression, drawing, things like that with their smartphone. When you look at this and you think about individual apps, so let's take Amazon, for instance, and we could do this with any breadth of different applications and or mobile websites that we have. But if you take Amazon specifically and think about Amazon, inherently you would probably put that in shopping, right? You can shop on Amazon. You can buy things. The purpose of the app is to buy and shop. But Amazon, depending on, again, the motivation for consuming that content that the consumer is going to Amazon to do, can also vary. Amazon can also fit into Accomplish, and it can also fit into Me Time. When you think about Me Time, you're thinking, how does Amazon fit into Me Time? How does Amazon entertain or be this sort of lean-back tool? Well, the Amazon app, when you start talking to consumers, has become a little bit more of a catalog. So where you would get the J. Crew or Pottery Barn or West Elm or whatever, those catalogs that are coming into your house, you're sitting on your couch, you're relaxing, you're flipping through it. You're not necessarily going to buy anything. It's entertaining for you. You're flipping through it. The Amazon app is also taking on part of those qualities now for consumers from a smartphone standpoint. When you think about Accomplish, well, Amazon actually lets you accomplish a lot of things. I have to get my brother a birthday gift. His birthday's in a week. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to Amazon. I'm going to order that gift. I did that. I accomplished something. That was my purpose and my motivation for going to that Amazon app at that given point in time. So apps, while inherently you would look at it from any sort of behavioral data standpoint or behavioral tracking, and you would think, oh, these are actually really different behaviors. They're going on the weather app, or they're going to Domino's Pizza, or they're going to Amazon. These are very distinct and different behaviors. I would talk to them potentially differently or think about that differently. When actually they have the same motivation. They're actually all parts or can be fitting into this me time, this relaxation, this entertain me mode. Just depends on what frame of reference that consumer is in at the time when they're going to that app. So it's a lot more of a deeper motivation behind consuming content than what we would just look at if we only purely looked at the behavioral data. If you think about what is the biggest, so when consumers are actually consuming content with any of these different motivations, which is actually the biggest in terms of the time spent? It's actually me time, 46%. It comprises the largest chunk of time. But brands are really missing the opportunity. So we had asked some very basic ad effectiveness questions. So this wasn't looking at what we would think about standard ad effect like brand recall or intent to purchase or something like that. This is purely looking at how do consumers view the advertising? Was it helpful to them? Did they like it? Was it a distraction? Was it helpful to them? And while they're spending a lot of time in me time when they're consuming content on their smartphone, ads are really not speaking to them at all. They don't really like it. It's not helpful to them. Ads are performing really well in Accomplish, in Socialize, in Shop, because that's traditionally, again, going back to that conventional wisdom and that conventional behavior, that's traditionally how marketers have been thinking about and using advertising within mobile platforms. So a lot of advertisements are written in that context, but they're not written in the context of me time. And what the consumer really wants from a creative messaging standpoint in me time is to fit their needs for why they're actually consuming that content in the first place, which is to entertain me, to make me laugh, to be relevant to my interests. So we knew a lot about how consumers were consuming content on their smartphone, the motivations for consuming that content, and how they felt about advertising. So what we wanted to dig a little bit more into was, what is the mobile content experience like for consumers across platforms? Because again, in this first study, we just looked at smartphone. We didn't look at tablet or even desktop for that matter. So we wanted to go back and talk to consumers again from a cross-platform standpoint. So let's go talk to consumers who have a tablet, who have a smartphone, and who have a computer. One of the first things we did was we did some qualitative exercises with them, and we made them do some deprivation exercises. Consumers did not like us at all when we made them do this. They were not happy with us because we sort of tricked them and said, tell us of these 3 devices, which is your favorite device? So between your computer, your mobile device, your smartphone, or your tablet, which is your favorite? So they told us their favorite. And then we said, okay, cool, don't use it for a day. Can't turn it on, keep it in the drawer, can't take it with you when you go outside, cannot use it at all. You can use the other two devices. You can use, if you had to give up your computer, you could use your tablet and your smartphone, but you could not turn your computer on for a full day. And then we made them journal about their experiences. And we got some not so pleasant responses all the time because they weren't really happy about it, but we found some interesting insights. So without the computer, people just would not do the task. So whatever they wanted to do on the computer that day, they just didn't even try to replicate that activity on the tablet or the smartphone. So they just kind of felt very unproductive. And so they would actually go out and do things that weren't even related to anything digital. They would go mow the lawn, or they'd go clean the house, or they'd do all these different things. But they just wouldn't do it. Without the smartphone, these people were extremely anxiety-ridden. They were the ones that really didn't like us the most because they felt completely disconnected. So a lot of the tasks that they would have wanted to do with their smartphone, they couldn't do, especially on the go, because they felt this complete and utter disconnection, like, oh my God, what if my child calls me, I'm out and about, I don't have my tablet's not enabled on the network, my computer's at home, I can't connect with anybody, and I'm out and about, and oh, what could happen? I'm so disconnected. When they were at home, or they were connected to any sort of other device, or had Wi-Fi or things like that, they would replicate some of the activities from a communication standpoint with things like Facebook Messenger, or FaceTime, or things like that. So they would attempt to contact or email or things where they would attempt to still communicate to other people. But when they were out and about and didn't have any of those other options, they were extremely paranoid. But without a tablet, people actually found a way to get something done. They were a little annoyed if we made them give up their tablet because the tablet was nice and convenient. All the apps were there. You knew exactly it was one button to turn on, one button to click. You got right into your application. It was super easy. They had to sort of relearn what to do in terms of trying to get at that content or trying to watch that video, whatever they were trying to do on their tablet. They sort of had to relearn how to do that on either the desktop or the smartphone, but they could do it. So they didn't have a whole lot of anxiety there. They just felt a little inconvenienced and things took them a little bit longer. So what we saw was that truly the tablet was sort of the crossover device, right? So there were definitely things that the smartphone could only do, there's things that the computer could only do, but there wasn't one thing that exclusively was related to the tablet. It's a nice to have, it provides some benefit, but there wasn't something that would make people say, oh my God, I can't necessarily live without my tablet if I had to. So we want to go a little bit deeper and really look at, so what is the value then of each of these three screens? So for people who own all three of these devices, what is the inherent value? And it actually led us to take a different approach on research and modeling especially, to look at quantitative data. So we ended up going to and using what we call a Shapley model and Shapley analysis, which basically answers the question, are we better off together? So through a very intricate quantitative design, we looked at any different combination of these devices. So the computer on its own, the tablet on its own, the smartphone on its own, or any given combination of the two of them or all three together. So again, all of the respondents in the sample had to have all three devices, and then we just placed them into different buckets. So we had equal representation across any of these different buckets or types of content consumption. And what Shapley does is it really borrows from game theory, because it looks at basically assigning a value to each member of the coalition to see how they each contribute to the overall success metric. So if we take, for instance, I'll just describe this, some of you are probably fairly familiar with this technique in general, but just in case, if you take the example of an ice cream shop. This is an easy way to think about it. So an ice cream shop sells chocolate, they sell vanilla, they sell strawberry. And you're pretty much going to have a consumer who would take one of those, but probably doesn't necessarily like any of the other two. They're fairly mutually exclusive in terms of flavors and desire. And the ice cream shop is making a pretty good profit based on those three flavors. But they want to add an additional flavor because they want to actually increase their profits and increase their revenue. But they don't want to cannibalize any of the sales from the existing three flavors. So what Shapley would do was let them assign different values to additional flavors so that their overall profit would be higher. But again, you're not pulling any additional money away from any of your first three flavors. So what we do from a standpoint of media is flip that a little bit. So from a media standpoint and from a content provider standpoint, our success metric is getting consumers to come back to our site regularly, right? We want people to come back to the Huffington Post. We want people to come back to AOL.com. We want them to like the content and make it a regular part of their routine. So the success metric in the Shapley model was getting people to want to go back or have a high likelihood to go back and go back to that website on the device in which we were asking them to go to it on in the first place. So when you think about that in relationship to actual percentages, so you can see our overall success metric here is basically 67%. So that's the highest we could ever get in terms of revenue or in terms of intent to visit regularly, which is this question. So if we had a consumer go to their own favorite website, they got to choose their website based on a couple of different categories that we would place them into. And said, okay, go view that website on your smartphone, go view that website on your tablet, go view that website on your desktop, and then tell me how likely you are to go back to that website again on that device. So if they went to that website on all three devices, 67% of them would go back on all three devices again. But if you look at that across different combinations of screens on one or two screens, this is where Shapley becomes really important in terms of the overall analysis. So if you take smartphone individually, so 35% of consumers would go back to that website on their smartphone. But when you look at smartphone and tablet, 54% of consumers would go back to that website on their smartphone and their tablet. That's a pretty big jump from 35 to 54%. Well, if you look at tablet alone, that's at 49. So there's a pretty good assumption there that would go into the model. It's that the tablet actually brings more value to the consumer in terms of their desire to go back to that website again on those devices. So what Shapley does is it looks at all of these different combinations, rolls them all up, and kind of spits out a nice number to give the overall value that each of these devices brings to the total. So the actual values, when we rolled all of this up, and Shapley values can range from -1 to +1. So you could, any of these could have had a negative desire or a negative intent to get a consumer to actually want to go to that website again on that device. None of them did. All of them positively contributed. They just contributed at different levels. What's interesting, though, is how much the tablet brings in terms of value and how close the tablet is to the computer. So the computer still wins in terms of the overall value of wanting to go to that content site again. But the tablet's pretty close and the smartphone is a little bit behind. That does vary a little bit. And if you actually normalize the values, that's what this is. If you want to think of it, Shapley's not really a percentage, but you can sort of normalize that based on that 67% I showed you earlier. So you can make it sound like a percentage. So the computer contributes 42% to the overall value of wanting to go back to that website, whereas the tablet contributes 36% and the smartphone 22%. And again, this is overall. There are some additional breaks. So if you look at age, and you take age specifically, 18 to 34-year-olds actually value the smartphone more. Okay? The millennials definitely value the smartphone a little bit more because a lot of times from some of the qualitative, and we've done a lot of other research on millennials specifically, they like that aspect of on the go. They like that aspect of always connected, always there. And so they put a little bit more value to that on their smartphone. But the tablet is actually really influential for those who are 35 plus. It's actually closer even to the computer in terms of driving that overall value to want to go back to that website. Now when you talk about websites, these were the different categories that we would put consumers in terms of content, genres of content. So the overall number you saw was a roll-up of all of these different genres. And again, the consumer got to choose their favorite website within that genre. We just directed them to the genre based on how they would typically go to or view that in any given day. What's interesting here is how much the value of these devices varies by content. So if you look at tech and entertainment specifically, the tablet brings a lot of value, actually beating the computer here in terms of getting consumers to want to consume that content again on that device. While cooking and food actually has some variability. All the devices are actually pretty equal. And when we dig into, specifically within that category, why consumers, the motivation for consuming content across those devices, it actually varies quite a bit. For the computer and cooking and food, it's to find something new. But for the tablet, it's to actually kind of be in the kitchen and cooking. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit more of an action tool. And then Mobile is used a little bit more in store because you can look up your recipes in store while you're in the market and actually get some additional information. It's this new, on-the-go, quick and easy, I want to find out what I need. But for some traditional sites, news and sports, finance, banking, auto, fashion, and home, the computer still definitely wins, which I think has a lot to do with the consumer's familiarity with the content on the desktop device. There's a lot to be said, even for the reasons why I think computer is overall the strongest device. Consumers, it takes a while for them to learn new things, right? And for that to be a part of their behavior and their habitual behavior. They're very familiar with the computer. They know exactly where it is and know exactly how to search. It's something that they've been doing for years and years and years. They're less familiar with the tablet and the smartphone in terms of functionality and device, and that technology is changing very rapidly all the time. So they're constantly having to sort of learn new processes, but the computer kind of stays very consistent. So it still brings a lot of value to actually consuming content. And especially for advertising, it plays a bigger role in terms of the value of ad recall. And when you look at cross-screen synergies, here's another additional point of where these mobile devices come in a lot more. So if you look at how much more do consumers want to, again, go back to that website or go back and reread that content across device, there's a lot of benefit to 2 devices and even to 3 devices. So multiple consumption points for different pieces of content is hugely beneficial to consumers. They like having that. They like having it at their fingertips. And they like having that added value of the tablet. So a lot of times, the value of the computer alone is pretty strong, but then when you add in a smartphone, or for finance and banking, a tablet, or any different combination of those 2, again, the consumer has a better frame of reference. They like that content more. They want to go back to it. So 2 is stronger than 1 in a lot of instances. If you look at text specifically, this is where one of them where the tablet really wins. Again, a lot of the motivations for usage are fairly similar. So it's to get news or information that's interesting to me, satisfy my need or curiosity, discover something new. And some of these motivations will vary by device in different categories. And this one, they were fairly consistent and the same. So some key takeaways for you guys. Again, conventional wisdom is often actually quite wrong. Mobile isn't always mobile, and me time is definitely at home, and me time is the longest portion of time spent by mobile. Tablets can actually contribute quite a lot of utility to actually bringing to content. So you actually need to understand the motivation and not just the behavior when you're actually doing research within these different devices and for these different types of content. And the opportunity is definitely a lot greater than geolocation services. There's a lot of interesting opportunities there, especially if you think about me time for mobile and even for tablet. We've done a lot of other research in tablet as well to figure out how to really talk to consumers within that frame of reference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cortney. Thank you. So I know we're running over, but we will take a question before we go for a coffee break.
Hey, Cortney, that was great. Question for the analysis on the Shapley values. It was going to a website visit, right? So it was a website, it wasn't an app corresponding?
We did not specify. So all we told them was that, tell us what your favorite site is within that content. So if they got put into the tech group, for instance, we said, tell us what your favorite website is in the tech category. So they would tell us their favorite website, and then we just said, okay, now go to that site or go to that content on any of the 3 devices that we kind of put them in terms of respondents. So we didn't specify if it had to be app or mobile web.
Right.
It could have been anything.
Okay.
We didn't track that.
I'm just wondering how much that causes the bias in the smartphone, because a lot of times smartphone, you're using it for a different function. You're using an app access because of the functionality versus actually trying to find the URL on the website. And tablets, I would use my tablet for a site, but I would not use my smartphone. I'm just wondering how much that plays and whether that's even measurable.
Yeah, I think it could. It definitely could. I mean, there's definitely a lot of apps. There's a lot of apps in the tablet as well. We didn't see that necessarily a similar story within the tablet. But I think a lot of it is more to do with familiarity with the device, to be honest, and really thinking about how to, there's just certain things that consumers, as we keep kind of studying smartphone, that they'll kind of wait and do certain things on the tablet or the computer
I see.
because they, it's too small, they can't read it, it. They have to optimize too much, and then they can't sort of track that across different sizes. So and that's stuff that we also look at just to make our sites better on those different devices, because there's a difference in terms of how consumers actually get that content in an easy fashion. And so a lot of times some will definitely negate it, which I think is why partially why the millennials were a little bit higher for the smartphone.
Right.
It's easier for them to kind of read that content. They're more used to that in terms of they've been digital since birth, and they can kind of get used to that, whereas the older are not as much.
Great insights. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, we're going to go now and take a coffee break, and we'll start back in here at 4 o'clock. Thank you.